I've made it no secret that George Romero's Day of the Dead is my favorite of the three classics. I mean, I love them all, but I just think that this was the peak of his creativity, especially in this genre, and it certainly concludes an unofficial trilogy. What I've found from many of the fans is that they tend to shy away from this movie because the film basically has a tendency to be over the top with its acting. Roger Ebert heavily criticized this movie for it. And yeah, I can see it, I suppose. Everyone is yelling, there's loads of pent-up anger, things like that. In fact, it kind of reminds me of Roger Corman's The St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Everyone in that movie is yelling, angry, pissed, or just killing people. Throughout the entire movie, there's no break in it. And to be honest, Day of the Dead is very much so like that. Out of context, I agree with this criticism of Day of the Dead. You look at any generic clips of Joe Pilato as Captain Rhodes, and yeah, that's very easily very over the top. Laurie Cardile, who plays Sarah, even brought this up in the fantastic audio commentary, and Romero's reaction was interesting. I don't think so, he said. He went on to explain that he firmly thinks their situation is so outrageous that these people have been out there underground for so long, everything naturally would have been heightened emotionally. And I actually agree with him. And with the context of the situation in this movie in mind, the so-called over-the-top acting isn't really over-the-top at all. It's actually quite natural. Something that really sells this is the location itself. That was a real mine they were actually shooting in, 6 days a week with no sunlight. By the time the day wrapped, the cast and crew would exit the mine only to find that it was now dark out. It was nighttime. As someone who often works through the night, yeah, I can understand what everyone was feeling. They felt fatigued all the time, they felt sick, their skin was getting pale, they were getting depressed. We need sunlight in order to function. It's called vitamin D, and we fucking need it. But in the commentary, Romero and Laurie both said that it actually helped their performances. Just like the characters on screen, they would desperately try to cheer each other up behind the camera in an attempt to stay sane, as they put it. And listening to Tom Savini talking about the gags he did off camera is actually quite a joy to listen to. But our characters in the film were doing the same damn thing. Look at John and Bill's hideaway. They got daylight bulbs, fake trees, and loads of shit just to simulate the outside world. And I'd bet it even worked for a while. By the time of the film, though, which takes place only over the course of a few days, by the way, not even that can work anymore. I mean, it was John who shouts, "This is a 14-mile tombstone." Most of the army guys have been killed due to Frankenstein's experiments, leaving Rhodes in charge of a vast, deteriorating situation. And the resentment is high because there have been little results that they can see. It's easy to keep going if you can see what you're doing is worth it. You can actually see the results. But when you can't, what's the point? This also means that they are extremely overworked and try to keep up with the demand of zombies for Frankenstein, which this leads to Miguel and the entire crux of his character. The scientists are lacking because of seeing little results. Laurie and the others are down because they've searched for miles upon miles around for months after months after months and found no survivors at all. Everyone is just plain old isolated. And to make it worse, the mine only makes them even more isolated from the outside world, period. It establishes that if they continue going outside, the fences won't hold off the hordes anymore. So now they're literally trapped, all of them, inside this dark, dank mine, day after day after day after day. And what I find interesting is that on the surface, this seems pretty black and white as to whom are the good guys and whom are the bad guys. The military dudes are the clear villains who just laugh and yell and kill. And the scientists are the calm, rational people trying to make the best of a bad situation. But my favorite scene, featuring a lot of those so-called overacting, is when Rhodes tells Steele to shoot Sarah. At first he jokes, but when things become serious, the look on Steele's face is one of confliction, confusion, and a bit of horror. Here, he'd be only shooting an unarmed civilian, Sarah in this case. There's no sport in that, nor are there any ethics in it. But if he doesn't, Rhodes will kill him. And I love the dichotomy of that. He doesn't want to do it, but he doesn't want to die either. And that sort of shit goes into Rhodes as well. His superior was just killed, and Rhodes has little to work with. Rhodes just simply isn't cut out for command. He's a coward more than he is an asshole resorting to violence, yelling, and anger to resolve his own personal issues. The scene I just mentioned is proof. He won't shoot Sarah, but he can shoot Steele, a soldier with a weapon on hand, have Steele do it, and keep his conscience clear. I actually really like that. And Rhodes is the first to ditch the other soldiers when the zombies make it into the mine. He just runs away and abandons them, which leads to the most epic death scene of all time. Miguel and Sarah are in many ways the epitome of what I'm talking about here, what is happening. Miguel is so tired, frustrated, and angry, he's actually cracking. And because he's seen so many of his friends die around him, he thinks he has to pick up the slack more and more without taking any breaks. Because if he takes a break, that means other people are having to pick up the slack for him as well. And when Sarah tries to comfort him, Miguel only sees this as weakness, while Sarah sees this as necessary. But Sarah is the same damn thing. When Miguel gets bitten, I love what she does. She's right there, knows what to do, takes charge, and handles the situation. It's one reason why she's actually one of my favorite female protagonists of all time, just put to film, period, and why I think she deserves more recognition than she does. And when Rhodes confronts Sarah, she explodes with anger and threatens to shoot him. The situation has high adrenaline, its emotions are heightened, teeth-grittingly so. And then it all boils to when Rhodes and the others leave, and Sarah just breaks down. It's a wonderful scene of things piling on top of each other in rapid succession and climaxing not with an explosion like you'd expect, but with a horrific whimper. I love this movie, in case you couldn't tell. This scene in particular has been criticized for being over the top. Rhodes is yelling and mugging, Steele is pissed at Miguel for almost killing him, Sarah is screaming at Rhodes, but in context, these actions and performances make perfect sense. It's the large climax of decision-making. It's the moment Sarah decides it's best to get the hell out of the mine and figure things out afterwards. It's the moment Rhodes decides the same damn thing. The room is dark, there's zombies screaming, ready to eat them, a man's arm has just been chopped off. Of course their emotional states are going to be heightened. The adrenaline alone from the situation would put the most level-headed of men into a frenzied state. So to say that this scene is over the top, I don't really buy it. These are just people pushed to the utter extreme and reaching their limit. And it's clear that besides Frankenstein, we'll get to him in a little bit, these are just normal people, Rhodes included. Normal people thrust into something hastily and shoddily put together, and most importantly, beyond their control. So let's briefly talk about Frankenstein, that I just barely mentioned him. He's the only one who I can say was a bit off of his rocker before the zombie apocalypse beforehand. And I'm not saying he was crazy, he was just a bit odd, like Asperger's odd. But even then, he was still pretty normal. And despite this, he still mirrors everyone else, though he seems to be the only one confident in what he is doing. His biggest problem here is a lack of communication with not only the army guys, but also his own scientists, and it becomes clear that as time progresses, even within the film itself, he grows more and more and more isolated. So his performance mirrors that. He comes off as awkward, with no social graces, even a bit crazy. Like he's become so obsessed with his own work that he can't see the others crumbling around him. Either that or he just genuinely doesn't care, which in itself is frightening, and it even could be a mixture of both. Romero never really talked about him that much as a whole. The only things Frankenstein seems to show affection for is Bub, my favorite zombie of all time. And while I won't get into their complex and fascinating relationship here, that could be for another podcast, All I'll say is that these parts alone make the movie worth watching. But because of Frankenstein's own inability to communicate with others because of his obsession with his work and progress, it leads to him being unable to convince Rhodes that what he's doing could actually be a great thing. And it also goes to show how far Frankenstein has gone from reality outside of his own workshop, that he willingly uses the corpses of dead soldiers, many of them were friends, by the way, as Bub's treats. He says they won't find out, but of course they do. And it is clear that the thought of Rhodes and the others finding out never even crossed Frankenstein's mind. So he's just like the others, but on the opposite end of the spectrum, two sides of the same coin. He's so obsessed with the results and actually seeing them, he's lost touch with reality. And thus, his actions are justifiable in my opinion. Yes, he's eccentric. Yes, to someone with no context, he appears to be over the top in both his presentation and mannerisms, but he really isn't. He's just like the others. So no, this movie doesn't have over-the-top acting. I mean, sure, it's certainly louder than we see in the mumblefest that is The Walking Dead, or even the other great zombie flicks by Lucio Fulci, Danny Boyle, or even games like The Last of Us. But that doesn't mean it's over the top. It's perfect the way it is. In fact, if it were any way else, really, if George Romero had decided to tone it down, to me the movie wouldn't have worked. He wanted to present people on the edge, people pushed to their physical and mental limits, people on the verge of utter collapse. And how else could that be presented? We don't mumble like we see in most movies today. We don't have long-winded speeches. We don't have the sexy tear and no snot coming out of our noses when we cry. We get angry, we shake, we curse, we scream and yell, we blame everyone else but ourselves. We get so emotional that we don't stop to think about how we look at or act with others. We just care about the now and what's bothering us. And that isn't saying that that's a bad thing, not at all. It's just reality. We do get all covered in snot when we cry. We do just want to punch some asshole in the face. We do scream and yell and curse every four-letter word under the sun. And that's what happens in Day of the Dead. Go on Facebook, like AN Productions for all up-to-date information of what we're doing there. Follow our website, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, blah, blah, blah. All information is available in the description below. In the end, this is Adam Noyce of AN Productions saying, sayonara.